Amanda Blake may have lit up the screen as Miss Kitty on Gunsmoke, but few fans ever realized the emotional depth and silent burden she carried off camera. Her final years were not defined by fading fame, but rather by what she revealed, sometimes in passing comments, sometimes through quiet advocacy, about a hidden crisis that haunted the glittering halls of old Hollywood. It's been called many things since: the invisible epidemic, the industry's darkest secret, the untold tragedy. But Amanda knew it simply as the pain of losing friends who could never live their truth. It's now remembered as the Hollywood illness crisis. While the world saw her as a sharp-witted saloon owner with a heart of gold, Amanda moved through an industry built on illusion. Beneath the surface was a quiet storm of secrecy, stigma, and fear. This wasn't just a matter of image control or personal discretion. It was life or death for many stars. In an era when certain medical conditions were both incurable and untouchable in the media, those afflicted were often left to suffer in silence, abandoned by a system that prized perfection. Amanda, known for her empathy and fierce loyalty, watched helplessly as colleagues vanished from sets and headlines with no explanation. Deaths were attributed to natural causes or vague illnesses. Friends she had shared dressing rooms and laughs with were suddenly gone, their legacies swept under the rug to protect studios, careers, and reputations. These weren't isolated tragedies. They were part of a widespread, hushed phenomenon that shaped Hollywood's golden age in deeply tragic ways. As Amanda's own health began to decline later in life, her connection to this crisis grew more personal and more urgent. Though never one to grab headlines or make political waves, she began to speak more openly in private circles about what she'd seen. Her words carried the weight of someone who had nothing left to gain, only the truth to share. Those closest to her say she wished more people had spoken up sooner, that the silence had cost too much. Today, Amanda Blake's story is more than just a footnote in television history. It is a keyhole into a shadowed chapter of Hollywood's past. Her life reminds us that even in a world obsessed with fame and fantasy, there are real people behind the screens, people who lived, loved, suffered, and in many cases, died without the recognition or compassion they deserved. In this series, we look deeper into what Amanda knew, what she revealed, and what it tells us about the hidden lives of old Hollywood's biggest stars. It's a journey through glamour and grief, where truth was the ultimate forbidden story. And Amanda, in her final act, was one of the few who dared to tell it. Long before she became a household name, Amanda Blake had her sights set on something far greater than fame. Born Beverly Louise Neal in Buffalo, New York, she didn't fit the mold of a traditional Hollywood starlet. Her path to stardom was marked by persistence, talent, and an unshakable sense of individuality. When she arrived in Hollywood in the early 1950s, she quickly learned that talent was only part of the equation. The rest was navigating an unforgiving system that demanded perfection and punished authenticity. Her breakout role as Miss Kitty Russell on Gunsmoke catapulted her into the public eye. The show became a television institution, running for 2 decades, with Amanda at its heart. But while viewers saw a confident, resilient woman who owned the screen, Blake was grappling with the stark contrast between her on-screen strength and the reality of a deeply controlled industry. She witnessed firsthand how actors were groomed, shaped, and sometimes silenced by the studio machine. Hollywood in the 50s and 60s wasn't just about acting, it was about brand maintenance. Studios managed not only what stars wore and who they dated, but how they presented their personal values and beliefs. A single rumor, a whispered truth, could unravel an entire career. Amanda quickly learned that to survive, one had to play the game. That meant knowing what to say, when to stay silent, and how to navigate the ever-watchful eyes of producers, directors, and tabloid journalists. Despite the pressure, Amanda never fully surrendered to the system. Colleagues often remarked on her sense of justice, her quiet support for co-stars facing difficult times, and her ability to balance professional demands with personal integrity. Off camera, she was warm, generous, and deeply loyal, traits that sometimes clashed with the cutthroat environment around her. But it was these same qualities that later positioned her as a quiet ally for those who had no voice. As her star continued to rise, Amanda became more attuned to the subtle patterns of exclusion and fear around her. She began to notice that some actors seemed to live in the shadows, navigating their careers with caution, hiding parts of themselves to stay employed. These weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a larger sickness within the industry, one Amanda would later refer to, without naming names, as the real cost of fame. What she didn't realize at the time was that this pattern would only intensify. Over the coming years, the consequences of this silencing would grow darker more tragic. And Amanda, always observant, would become one of the few to see just how deep the damage ran. Long before she became a household name, Amanda Blake had her sights set on something far greater than fame. Born Beverly Louise Neal in Buffalo, New York, she didn't fit the mold of a traditional Hollywood starlet. Her path to stardom was marked by persistence, talent, and an unshakable sense of individuality. When she arrived in Hollywood in the early 1950s, she quickly learned that talent was only part of the equation. The rest was navigating an unforgiving system that demanded perfection and punished authenticity. Her breakout role as Miss Kitty Russell on Gunsmoke catapulted her into the public eye. The show became a television institution, running for 2 decades, with Amanda at its heart. But while viewers saw a confident, resilient woman who owned the screen, Blake was grappling with the stark contrast between her on-screen strength and the reality of a deeply controlled industry. She witnessed firsthand how actors were groomed, shaped, and sometimes silenced by the studio machine. Hollywood in the 50s and 60s wasn't just about acting, it was about brand maintenance. Studios managed not only what stars wore and who they dated, but how they presented their personal values and beliefs. A single rumor, a whispered truth, could unravel an entire career. Amanda quickly learned that to survive, one had to play the game. That meant knowing what to say, when to stay silent, and how to navigate the ever-watchful eyes of producers, directors, and tabloid journalists. Despite the pressure, Amanda never fully surrendered to the system. Colleagues often remarked on her sense of justice, her quiet support for co-stars facing difficult times, and her ability to balance professional demands with personal integrity. Off-camera, she was warm, generous, and deeply loyal, traits that sometimes clashed with the cutthroat environment around her. But it was these same qualities that later positioned her as a quiet ally for those who had no voice. As her star continued to rise, Amanda became more attuned to the subtle patterns of exclusion and fear around her. She began to notice that some actors seemed to live in the shadows, navigating their careers with caution, hiding parts of themselves to stay employed. These weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a larger sickness within the industry, one Amanda would later refer to, without naming names, as the real cost of fame. What she didn't realize at the time was that this pattern would only intensify. Over the coming years, the consequences of this silencing would grow darker, more tragic. And Amanda, always observant, would become one of the few to see just how deep the damage ran. As Amanda Blake settled deeper into her career, she found herself surrounded by a world where whispers often said more than headlines. Off-camera, behind the velvet curtains and polished PR stunts, there existed a community of performers quietly living dual lives. They were stars by day and secrets by necessity. Amanda, always perceptive, began to notice the subtle glances, the unspoken camaraderie, the carefully coded conversations. It wasn't hard to connect the dots. Some of Hollywood's most beloved figures were hiding parts of themselves for fear of exposure. In an industry built on illusion, being different could mean professional death. And in mid-20th century America, being gay was considered not only controversial, it was career-ending. The studios had long practiced morality clauses, allowing them to terminate contracts if an actor's private life was seen as damaging to their public image. For many LGBTQ performers, this meant living in a constant state of vigilance. Relationships were hidden, real identities buried under layers of manufactured narratives. Public romances were sometimes staged. The truth stayed behind closed doors. Amanda wasn't just a passive observer. Friends say she had a knack for creating safe spaces, quiet moments on set, dinners after long shoots, private conversations laced with empathy instead of judgment. It was during these moments that she began to hear the stories of heartbreak, of betrayal, of fear. Actors who couldn't visit partners in the hospital. Talented performers passed over for major roles because of rumors. Careers that stalled without explanation. These weren't distant stories, they were personal, and they were multiplying. As the 70s approached, a quiet awareness started growing among the tight-knit circles Amanda belonged to. Something was changing, not just socially, but physically. Healthy young men in their prime were falling ill. The symptoms varied, but the outcome was often the same: sudden disappearances, unexplained deaths, and a chilling silence from the studios. It was the early rumblings of what would later be known as a crisis, but at the time, no one had a name for it. Amanda felt it firsthand. Friends began vanishing. Former co-stars, makeup artists, and assistants, people she'd known for years, were simply gone. There were no funerals, no obituaries, just a creeping void that seemed to swallow memories whole. She asked questions, but answers were scarce. The industry, as it always had, preferred silence over scandal. Still, Amanda remembered. She remembered the laughter on set, the shared dreams, the vulnerable conversations under studio lights. And she carried those memories with her, not out of nostalgia, but out of duty. She had seen too much to pretend it wasn't happening. What Amanda didn't know yet was that these hidden stories were only the beginning. The whispers she had heard for years were about to become screams, and Hollywood would be forced to face a truth it had tried desperately to bury. By the late 1970s and early 80s, the veil of mystery that had long obscured the disappearances in Amanda Blake's circle began to lift, but only slightly. The sudden illnesses that had struck fear into the hearts of many in Hollywood were becoming more common, more devastating, and yet still remained unspoken. No one dared say the name aloud, even as it devastated the lives of performers, stylists, producers, and friends. It was a silent epidemic wrapped in shame, denial, and misinformation. Amanda, now in the twilight of her acting career, watched in quiet horror as the whispers she'd heard for years became something darker. She wasn't a doctor, nor did she have the words to define what was happening, but she knew the look in a friend's eyes when they were hiding pain. She had seen enough to recognize when someone was sick and scared. These weren't rare tragedies anymore. They were regular, cruel patterns. Young, vibrant people wasting away. Deaths chalked up to pneumonia or rare infections, excuses that became chillingly familiar. The media wasn't reporting on it. The studios definitely weren't talking. The powers that be continued to protect their images while quietly distancing themselves from those suffering. As Amanda put the pieces together, it became clear this was bigger than fear. It was systemic erasure. The entertainment world had decided it was easier to pretend the illness didn't exist than to confront the implications. Because to acknowledge, it would mean acknowledging who was being affected most and why. For Amanda, this wasn't just another Hollywood scandal. It was personal. Some of the men she'd worked with on Gunsmoke, from crew to occasional guest stars, simply stopped showing up one day. There were no announcements, no memorials, just silence. She tried reaching out, sending cards, calling family members, but was often met with resistance or vague statements. It became obvious that fear of stigma, not just grief, was driving people underground. Behind the scenes, Amanda started speaking up more. Not loudly, not publicly, but intentionally. She donated to causes quietly, supported care homes, and offered help when others wouldn't. She never exploited these moments for publicity. To her, they weren't stories to be sold. They were people. Friends, artists who had shaped her life and her career, and whose suffering she refused to let go unnoticed. Still, she struggled with the limits of what she could do. The disease, though not named, was beginning to make national headlines, and even then, it was couched in euphemisms and panic. Hollywood illness, some called it in hushed tones, as if the phrase itself might spread infection. Amanda knew better. It wasn't Hollywood that caused the illness, it was Hollywood's silence that let it spread. And as the 1980s rolled on, that silence would become unbearable. Because one day, Amanda wouldn't just be a witness to the tragedy. She'd be drawn into it in the most personal, irreversible way. Amanda Blake had spent much of her life bearing witness, watching friends vanish from public life, seeing the same vague obituaries pass across her desk, and wondering why no one dared to speak plainly. But nothing could have prepared her for the moment when the quiet crisis she'd spent years observing turned inward and made her its next target. By the late 1980s, Amanda's health had begun to decline in ways that were both sudden and baffling. At first, it was exhaustion. Then came infections that wouldn't go away. She had always been strong, even during the toughest filming schedules of Gunsmoke. But now the smallest tasks drained her. Her doctors ran tests, but there was never a clear answer, at least not one they were ready to say out loud. Friends close to Amanda would later reveal that she suspected the truth before anyone ever confirmed it. She'd seen this pattern before. She knew what it looked like when someone went from vibrant to frail in months. What she didn't know, what no one could know for sure, was how it had happened to her. Rumors circulated almost immediately. Some claimed it was cancer. Others suggested an autoimmune disorder. The press, eager to protect her legacy, or perhaps uncomfortable with the implications, opted for vague headlines and softer language. But those who had been paying attention to Amanda's quiet advocacy, her friendships, and her chosen causes over the years began to understand the bitter irony. The illness she had long watched devastate others had found its way into her life, and now she was experiencing firsthand the fear, stigma, and isolation she had once tried to fight from the sidelines. Despite her declining health, Amanda remained poised. She didn't retreat into total privacy or indulge in self-pity. Instead, she focused on what she could control, supporting animal rights, writing letters, and when possible, lending her voice to the quiet fight against the silence. She knew that her condition, however mysterious it remained in the public eye, could help shine a light on something bigger than herself. But even as the end neared, the truth remained unspoken in official circles. It would take years and much speculation before the real story began to emerge. And when it did, it wasn't through tabloid scandal or a shocking confession. It was through the slow, painful process of connecting the dots Amanda had quietly laid down in her final years. Hospital records, close confidants, and charity work began to form a picture far more complicated and more courageous than most would have imagined. In a world where silence was often the safest choice, Amanda chose quiet resistance. Not the kind that grabs headlines, but the kind that leaves a legacy. And when the illness came for her, she met it with the same quiet dignity she'd always carried. Her story was no longer just one of observation. It was of survival, of loss, and of choosing, right to the end, not to look away. For decades, old Hollywood operated under a strict, unwritten code. What happened off-screen stayed off-screen. Image was everything, and deviation from the manufactured persona of a star could mean instant exile. This code of silence wasn't just about protecting reputations, it was about protecting profits, studio power, and a fragile illusion that kept the machine running. Amanda Blake, like many, learned early on to stay in her lane, say the right things, and never let the cracks show. But as the years went on, and especially as she grew ill, that code started to feel less like protection and more like a prison. The silence had never sat comfortably with Amanda. She had seen too much to pretend it wasn't there. Brilliant actors disappearing from the limelight, friends cut off from work and support for reasons no one dared name. She never went public with dramatic statements or exposés, but those who knew her say she began to speak with less restraint behind closed doors. At charity events, in private letters, even in late-night phone calls, she'd reference the shameful way they're treated, or quietly ask, "How many more have to go before someone says it out loud?" Amanda's inner circle took notice. Unlike many of her peers, she wasn't willing to let fear dictate her final years. She used the limited power she had, her reputation, her public goodwill, to nudge conversations forward, subtly supporting causes that others still wouldn't touch. She began attending benefits that raised money for those quietly battling what many still refuse to name. She spoke to journalists off the record. She made it clear, in her own way, that the silence needed to break. It's important to understand how bold that was at the time. In the late 80s and early 90s, the entertainment industry was still deeply hesitant to associate itself with anything controversial, especially illnesses that were politically and socially charged. Careers could still be ruined by guilt through association. Public knowledge of Amanda's efforts could have stained her legacy, but she moved forward anyway. There was no grand moment when she took the podium and revealed it all. Instead, Amanda fought the silence the same way it had spread, quietly, insistently, and behind the scenes. Her strength wasn't in spectacle, it was in persistence. She made space for truth in a world that had tried so hard to bury it. And though she passed before the conversation truly opened up, her contribution mattered. When the press finally began reporting more honestly on the issue, and when later celebrities dared to speak publicly, Amanda's subtle defiance was part of the groundwork. She didn't need the spotlight to make a difference. She just needed to stop pretending. Her resistance, quiet, unglamorous, and personal, was the beginning of something larger. A long-awaited crack in the wall of silence that had shielded the truth for far too long. Behind the velvet curtains of Hollywood's golden age lay a graveyard of forgotten names, actors, directors, choreographers, costume designers, each with bright futures dimmed by a shadow no one dared acknowledge. These weren't figures who died of old age or faded into retirement. Many were young, in their prime, seemingly vanished without a trace. Their obituaries were sanitized, their medical histories sealed, and their legacies quietly erased. The loss was not only personal, it was cultural. Hollywood didn't just lose people. It lost voices, talent, and potential it never even fully recognized. Amanda Blake knew the names. She had worked with many of them. And as time went on, Their disappearances weighed on her like ghosts at a party no one else could see. There were actors who once shared the stage with her, never to be cast again after rumors began to circulate. There were crew members who suddenly stopped showing up, whose names were never spoken again on set. Each absence was treated like an inconvenience, not a tragedy. What made these losses even more painful was the deliberate nature of their erasure. Studios had a well-oiled playbook for dealing with scandal or sickness. Step 1. Pull the actor from upcoming projects. Step 2. Release a vague statement about health concerns or creative differences. Step 3. Ensure that no further questions were asked. This wasn't about privacy, it was damage control. Amanda's heartbreak wasn't just about the individuals. It was about the pattern. Time and again, those affected were the ones living outside the social norms of the time. Many were part of the LGBTQ+ community or had close ties to it. At a time when being different meant being disposable, these artists were written out of the story of Hollywood success. Their contributions, no matter how significant, were swallowed by a machine that only cared about appearances. In private, Amanda spoke about these losses with a kind of reverence. She didn't just mourn them, she remembered them. She shared their stories at quiet dinners, made donations in their names, and refused to let them be completely forgotten. Her efforts weren't loud, but they were sincere. She became a sort of unofficial archivist for a generation lost not just to illness, but to shame. The truth is, the golden glow of classic Hollywood came at a steep cost. For every household name that endured, there were dozens, perhaps hundreds, who didn't get the chance. They died without recognition, without ceremony, often with their stories left untold. Amanda Blake may have been one of the few who looked past the dazzle and dared to see what had really been lost. Her quiet mourning was a form of protest. By keeping their memories alive, even in whispered conversations, she pushed back against the silence. And in doing so, she preserved a part of Hollywood's history that would have otherwise disappeared completely. By the time Amanda Blake's health began to fail in the early 1980s, she had become one of Hollywood's quietest and most unwavering advocates for those forgotten by the system. It was a position she never sought but grew into over time, motivated not by personal gain, but by a sense of responsibility to those who had been erased from the narrative. As her illness took hold, Amanda's role as an industry icon became less about what she could do for herself and more about what she could do for those who could no longer speak for themselves. Her declining health, which had been exacerbated by complications related to cancer, forced her to step away from public life in the most profound way. But instead of retreating completely, Amanda's final years were spent speaking privately to those she trusted about the industry's darkest secrets, things she had witnessed and kept to herself for decades. It wasn't the fame, the adoration, or the public accolades that she cared about anymore. Her final mission was to shine a light on the truth that had remained buried in Hollywood's secret vault for far too long. In the midst of her own health battles, she began to speak about her own experiences of seeing countless colleagues disappear too soon, their names buried under euphemisms or outright fabrications. But it wasn't just the deaths that troubled her, it was the systemic silence that allowed it all to continue. Amanda had witnessed firsthand how the entertainment industry's machine could be merciless, how it could chew people up and spit them out without a care, and she was determined not to let that happen without someone calling it out. She didn't go to the press, nor did she make any public statements that could be used against her legacy. Instead, she confided in a few trusted friends, some of whom were fellow actors, some were directors or producers who had seen the same patterns. In these intimate conversations, Amanda expressed her disgust with the ways Hollywood had treated those most vulnerable, especially those who were gay, living with HIV, or battling other stigmatized illnesses. She urged her friends to remember the faces behind the headlines, the stories behind the silences. Amanda also turned her attention to the next generation of stars, especially the ones coming out of television. She would pass on advice to young actors she had worked with, stressing the importance of authenticity in a world that demanded perfection. She warned them of the dangers of fame, of how it could lure you into a world of silence and secrets. In doing so, Amanda became a mentor in her final years, offering wisdom and insight in an industry that often chewed up and spit out its most vulnerable. But even more than that, Amanda Blake's final act of defiance was in her refusal to stay quiet when the world expected her to fade into obscurity. She knew the world had often been uncomfortable with the truth, especially in regard to Hollywood's hidden crisis, and she had long lived under the weight of that uncomfortable silence. But as her life drew to a close, she refused to go quietly. Her bravery in those final years, speaking truth to power and carrying the weight of those who had been forgotten, ensured that her legacy would live on, not just as Miss Kitty from Gunsmoke, but as a woman who fought to reveal the stories the world didn't want to hear. As Amanda Blake's final years came to a close, the once-buried Hollywood illness crisis began to take on a different shape in the public consciousness. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the AIDS epidemic had reached its peak, and the shadows of the past were being pulled into the light. The industry that had once hidden its greatest tragedies was now forced to confront the loss of its brightest stars, many of whom had disappeared quietly in the years before the public had even begun to understand the full scope of the disease. For years, Amanda had watched in silence, but as the crisis reached a fever pitch, the veil of secrecy that had shrouded the lives of so many actors and creatives started to lift. The stigma surrounding HIV and AIDS had left many of Hollywood's most beloved figures in a state of invisibility, their struggles hidden behind a cloud of shame, misinformation, and fear. But slowly, the public began to grasp the magnitude of the epidemic, not just in Hollywood, but across the world. And in doing so, they were forced to reckon with the uncomfortable truths that had been ignored for far too long. By the time major figures like Rock Hudson, Liberace, and others publicly announced their diagnoses, it became clear that a silent epidemic had been sweeping through the entertainment industry for years, one that had affected far more people than had ever been acknowledged. For Amanda Blake, this was both an affirmation and a tragedy. She had known of the hidden losses long before the world did, and while she had quietly advocated for awareness and compassion in her final years, the battle was far from over. The disease wasn't just killing people, it was erasing their contributions, their legacies, and their humanity. In retrospect, the Hollywood illness crisis can be viewed as one of the most defining and devastating moments in the history of entertainment. It revealed not only how the industry handled or mishandled its most vulnerable, but also the social and cultural climate that allowed such tragedies to unfold without public acknowledgement. The fear of scandal, the need for control, and the overwhelming desire to protect the image of Hollywood itself meant that many stars never received the recognition they deserved in life, and were only publicly mourned after it was too late. Amanda Blake, in her own way, had seen this crisis unfold in real time. Her understanding of the pain and secrecy that plagued her peers shaped much of her final years. She spoke out, albeit quietly, because she knew the price of silence was far too steep. Her advocacy for those lost to the illness was a quiet but profound rebellion against a system that had long been defined by its willingness to ignore its own failures. The legacy of the Hollywood illness crisis is, of course, deeply intertwined with the fight for awareness, treatment, and the eventual push for LGBTQ+ rights. But it's also a reminder of the human cost of maintaining the carefully curated, picture-perfect image of Hollywood. The stars we loved, the ones who entertained and inspired us, were often hiding painful secrets, and many were forced to disappear because of it. It wasn't just a public health issue. It was a moral reckoning for an industry that had, for too long, valued its own image over the lives of its own people. And while Amanda Blake was never part of the public fight that came later, her quiet resistance in the face of Hollywood's darkest secrets helped pave the way for those who would rise up after her, demanding truth, compassion, and justice. Her legacy, much like the stars she honored in her final years, will not be forgotten. In the years following Amanda Blake's death, her legacy has been quietly woven into the tapestry of Hollywood's history, not just as a beloved actress, but as a symbol of compassion and truth in an industry that often values spectacle over sincerity. While the world may remember her primarily for her iconic role as Miss Kitty on Gunsmoke, there's a deeper and more enduring impact she left behind, a reminder of the unseen struggles faced by many of Hollywood's stars and the silent battles they fought in the shadows. Amanda's influence became especially evident in the wake of the Hollywood illness crisis and the AIDS epidemic that claimed so many lives in the 1980s and 1990s. By the time the epidemic reached its zenith, the silence that once surrounded it began to break. Public figures, especially those in the entertainment industry, began to step forward with their stories. The media, once quick to shield its stars from controversy, was forced to confront the reality of a disease that had taken the lives of some of Hollywood's most cherished icons. Although Amanda never became the public face of AIDS activism, her legacy influenced the way Hollywood would later deal with the illness and its aftermath. Her quiet advocacy for those who had fallen victim to the industry's stigmas paved the way for greater transparency, empathy, and support for individuals affected by HIV and AIDS. In private conversations, she spoke often about the need for understanding, pushing back against the misinformation that had surrounded the disease from the very beginning. Her wisdom, shared in confidence with those close to her, contributed to the changing tides of how Hollywood began to address issues related to health and acceptance. Moreover, Amanda Blake's actions had a ripple effect on the broader landscape of Hollywood's treatment of its stars, especially those marginalized by societal norms. She wasn't just fighting for those affected by illness, she was fighting for authenticity, for truth, and for the dignity of every actor whose career was shaped by secrecy and fear. In an era where public personas were tightly controlled by studios, Amanda stood out as a rare voice of humanity, someone who understood that real lives were at stake beneath the glossy surface of Tinseltown. Her role in shaping the dialogue around Hollywood's hidden crisis was not through grand public gestures, but through personal connections and quiet defiance. She didn't need to make speeches or headline charity events to make an impact. She made a difference by being the kind of person who would quietly support her colleagues in their time of need. Her influence is felt even today, as the entertainment industry continues to grapple with issues of representation, mental health, and the treatment of its stars in the face of personal hardship. Amanda's legacy has become a call for authenticity in an industry that often demands its stars conform to an idealized image. Her life serves as a reminder that behind the glitz and glamour of Hollywood's golden age, there were real people, people who suffered, who loved, who laughed, and who fought against an industry that too often valued image over substance. And as more stories from that era are uncovered, Amanda Blake's contributions to Hollywood's most tragic and hidden chapter will continue to resonate. Her quiet advocacy in the final years of her life has inspired a new generation of artists, activists, and fans who continue to challenge the industry's status quo and push for greater acceptance and transparency. Amanda Blake may no longer be here, but her influence endures in the hearts and minds of those who continue to fight for the truth.